Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer, Brandon Jones, and myself, Dan Strafford. And on this week's episode, we're going to take a look at some recent news around teachers. Teacher strikes that are planned for 2019, teachers quitting at the highest rate since that stat has been tracked back in 2001, and more data around current state of teaching in America. As always, want to bring in Brandon and Mike. Brandon, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. I will warn our listeners up front. I've got some strongly held beliefs on teachers and maybe on some of this subject as well. I've told folks before I'm the son of two teachers, so I'm excited to get into this topic.
Not only the son, but you also have other relatives who are teachers and administrators, right? Who
I do, absolutely. I've got lots of close family members who are, as you said, teachers and administrators. I went to K-12 education, so I had multiple teachers really every year for lots of my life. So yeah, lots of. I've been a Kaplan teacher, so much teachers, so much thoughts. Can't wait to share them.
And we'll get to that momentarily. Mike, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I also maybe not quite as heavily steeped in the teaching brew as my colleague Brandon, but yeah, my dad taught at the university and at high school, and and I did a bunch of the Kaplan tours of duty as well. And I may not be able to spit as much fire as Brandon this show, but I do have a few takes that I'm hoping to get out there as well. So I think it should be a fun conversation.
That is great. Now, I will, full disclosure, I have no teachers in my family other than cousins who are my age. So I didn't grow up with teachers in my household or from distant family. I have a lot of friends who became teachers back in my hometown. So full disclosure there. I have never taught myself. I mean, I've taught people things, but I've never taught a class or had to teach myself. So a different perspective there from me. But Brandon, it's a lot going on right now, right? So we have the article that came out from Wall Street Journal doing some research that teachers are quitting at the highest rate since that stat was tracked since 2001. Now, I will point out that it's still less than the Joe Q public or people in other job areas. It's still less than that, but it's a higher rate than we've seen before. And we see these strike articles coming out, LA, Oakland, Virginia. There's a lot going on to start 2019 with teachers. Where do you want to start? Where do you think this conversation begins? And obviously one that will continue throughout the year. I don't think we're going to cover it off here in entirety, but where do you want to start the conversation?
Yeah, I guess maybe we'll start with the teacher, America losing its teachers at a record rate. So that's one of the articles that we'll share out. So as you said, so during the first 10 months of the year, we lost teachers, and it's not just teachers, it's public educators. So teachers, community college faculty members, school psychologists, et cetera, quitting their jobs at a rate of 83 per 10,000. Which is nearly double the low water mark, which is 2009 of 48 per 10,000. So that's a big number, and I think that the article goes into, and we can talk a little bit about why. As you said, though, you call it Joe Q public, which I'm not sure all of our listeners would have picked up that just meant your everyman woman.
Yeah. There's also Jane S. Public.
Jane S. Public. Yeah. But so average roles, apparently, according to the same article, American workers leave their positions at a rate of 231 per 10,000. So, even this high water mark for teachers is still third of the average leave rate. So I guess that's a big deal. I mean, certainly when teachers leave school, it's disruptive. I mean, the teachers, one of the things that we have from our own statistics is that the thing that most strongly correlates to performance is experience. And that doesn't mean tenure necessarily. You can have a lot of experiences in a shorter time. And obviously there's some, some things baked into that numbers, because people who are either less interested or less good will attrit out of the system faster. And so, these aren't in our world here at Kaplan, these aren't, tenured positions or union contract negotiated positions where poor performers can just stay. So there's some of that in those numbers. But I think that when you have more and more tenured or people who would have otherwise become more tenured, people leaving, that's a problem. How big of a problem is it? I think it's a little hard to say, and I think it's important to keep in mind that number, that as high as that high water mark is, it's still only a third of the average for American workers. I think it's pretty important.
And I had a thought here, Mike, and I don't want to put us down a specific road, but wanted to get your take on whether or not you thought it was in line here. We've talked a lot about the gig economy. We've talked a lot about freelancing and the idea of people having multiple jobs. The teaching path has long been one that has been where you work. You become a teacher, and you're a teacher for life. Do you think there's any influence here of a younger generation, millennials, Gen Zers, who maybe are still in that mode of gig economy, seeking out what's best for them, and maybe those numbers will stay higher because of that? Younger workers moving on to another career or on to something else, whereas maybe older generations would have stuck in this path for their 25 to 30 years.
Yeah, that was right where I was heading with one of my takes. I think is really the whole notion of civic service and how teaching in some ways is one way to engage, and how rather than view it as a lifetime career where all you will do for the next 30 years is teach. I like the idea of spending maybe 5 or 10 years teaching and then going into the corporate world, or maybe trying to do something entrepreneurial and then coming back to it. And I also like the other idea, which is, starting in a more professional career path, like maybe a more corporate, kind of like what Teach for America does, but could it be more throughout your life? It's tricky for a number of reasons, but I think many of us have toyed with the idea of teaching high school, or teaching elementary school, or just giving back through the teaching dynamic. Dan, even the way you were talking about it at the open, it sounded like there's some openness to getting out there and trying it. But it's treated almost as though you either make the decision when you're an undergrad to become a teacher, or you don't. And if you don't, you're not going to be a teacher, which is why we need to keep the teachers we have. That model may be outdated, to your point, Dan, and it may be better to figure out how do you tap into 2 to 5 year tour duty. Brandon's point about experience being really important, I think, is critical. So you want to figure out who's going to be on a lifetime path as a teacher, and they're sort of the core of sort of your team. But the idea that more people could be tapping into their sort of educator selves, and then that might not be a lifetime commitment. It might be something you're in and out of. It's less more semi-permeable membrane there. I think is an interesting way to think about it.
It's a discussion definitely worth having, and I think you're seeing more and more, Brandon, alternate pathways to becoming a teacher. It used to be that you need to go study education, pass your test, and then become a teacher. You're seeing a lot of ways that substitute teachers can pass their exams and become a teacher, or even, as Mike's saying, someone who's had the experience in the corporate world or the private business world and come in and pass an exam and become a teacher. Do you see that experience as satisfactory, or do you think you need the experience of being a teacher to really help benefit the students who are in the classroom?
Yeah, I think I'm probably underqualified to answer that question, honestly. Sure. I mean, I don't think that there is only one track that you can follow to become qualified in most things. Like, I think, medicine, you probably want to go to medical school before you start, getting hands-on with patients. But I think there's some art as well as some science, and there is some science in teaching. And so I would embrace, especially in a world where we need more teachers, I would embrace a broader funnel that brings people into the teaching ranks. Specifically, what one needs to do to be, in nursing, they use the language like safe and effective, right? There's a test that determines if someone's going to be a safe and effective nurse. Determining what would make one a safe and effective teacher, I think is an important question to answer that I can't. But I would, support, encourage, endorse, embrace a broadening of our thinking, and then a widening of the funnel of where we're getting teachers from.
A broad conversation around why teachers are leaving. I think, Mike, you hit on some of it, of that sort of gig economy and where they may go next, but also obviously, Brandon, throughout the country, we have articles around teacher pay and teacher pensions and vacation time and how much they have to pay themselves into the classroom. How much are they using their own funds to buy crayons and markers in elementary school, and tissues and dry erase markers and folders and whatever it may be each and every day. We see already on the horizon, Los Angeles has hired substitute teachers to fill in for teachers who are planning strikes later this month. Oakland, the same. You have Virginia may have a statewide walkout sometime soon. I don't know that I'm prepared to dive into a union discussion per se, but I do think that is a large part of a representation of the teacher union throughout the country. That's a lot for people to deal with. And I think we can talk about the student impact separately from the teacher impact, but I want to take the teacher impact first. So these strikes are seemingly happening soon, especially in LA. There are a few articles out about it. There are charter school implications. There are public school implications. There's a lot moving around here. From your experience, from your family, can you give some context around the articles we've read and what's being discussed and what needs to be understood about what's happening with these potential strikes?
Yeah, I mean, I'll share my perspective, and I would disclaim this as saying, like, I don't have. I think a lot of these things are really thorny, and there's really good rationale on both sides. Unless you are an expert, one is an expert, and I am not. I think it's tricky to get into the specific details of any of these particular teacher union, administration district negotiations. So, both my parents were English teachers. My father was the president of the teacher union in his school, and then ended up on the other side of it actually later as an administrator. So I got interesting perspective on both sides. My mom was part of a strike, and so what I felt was, as her child, it was disruptive to my family. So I think folks should think about striking teachers. Remember that those teachers have families around them, and seeing mom go to a strike instead of go to work, mom or dad or whomever, like that's real. And so I don't think most people who are striking are doing so on a whim or without consideration or without implication for their at least nuclear family. So there's like, you gotta believe it. That's a real thing that's having real impact. That said, I think that the interest of unions can be parochial to the constituents and not to the school, not to the student body. And that's hard. And, I think I said on this show before, I know when my father was a superintendent of schools, he was trying to, build in some professional development for his teachers. And, as, again, just an example, he couldn't require them to read a book without compensating them. And, these are educators who in theory, should be trying to stay abreast of the most recent trends in education. He couldn't assign them a podcast to listen to either, because this is before podcasts were invented.
You did get titular right there.
Yeah, there you go. But it's hard, and I think Certainly the factors that are informing some of the demands are the economy is good. And so I think average teacher wages have increased less than average US wages. That's not true by district, but it's not true for every sector in the public, but that is a motivating factor. You mentioned charter schools. That's like a whole new dimension that is, it's not brand new, but it's some of these negotiations like newly informative. It's hard. So I guess I would say in summation, these strikes will probably happen. We saw them happen in 2018. I think there's likely going to be more in 2019. They will be impactful to those schools. They'll be impactful to those students. They'll be impactful to the families of those teachers who are striking. And I think we should think it's in our public interest to help as we can, help those sides come to negotiated agreement because those kids, like they're there in those schools, either learning or not in those schools if they're not open. I think we got to keep our interests squarely focused on them too.
Mike, any thoughts here around the country? I think maybe from a lens of learning from this, we have a tendency, and this is my own opinion to disclaim like Brandon did, that we have a tendency to look maybe too high level. To Brandon's point, like each district is different. Each story is different here of what they're negotiating and why they're negotiating, how long they've been negotiating. I think in Oakland, it's been 2 years of negotiations. In LA, it's been around the same. Virginia, maybe a little shorter. But any thoughts around sort of this process and what we can learn and how, to Brandon's point, we can support or at least help push forward the discussion in a maybe more local sense around what's going on with teacher and teacher pay?
Yeah, to me, it ties to some of the activism and civic engagement we've talked about on the show a little bit as well, where I think it was either Oklahoma or West Virginia where I saw the kids were walking out, they were marching with the teachers, so like the idea that at least on a local level, if you could understand the needs of your local educators and then figure out why are they striking? And if they are actually, resorting to different aspects of collective action, is that something you support or not? So it is really it's an introspective moment for a parent, and it's a teaching moment for a kid where like you're trying to educate them on what's actually happening here, and then hopefully build in them a sense of responsibility to understand what's there and to actually take action when you feel the cause is just and you actually want to really advocate for your teachers. Another quick point too is I am struck by how where professions that are so mission oriented, like education, present opportunities for employers to take advantage of that mission-based orientation on the other side. So like when you have people who really, they know in their heart that they are teachers, they are educators, they really want to help these kids learn. They're willing to forego better pay opportunities. They're willing to forego personal advancement and comfort in their lives to give back. Frequently that allows for lower wages and it allows for less full support. And I think that's problematic. So like to Brandon's point, like what can we do to really build a better safety net for our educators so that they do feel supported from the administration, from their union, but I think probably more importantly from the community, which includes the parents of the kids that they're teaching. What can we do to, thank our educators for their service every year, every day, really? In some ways, it's among the most noble professions that are out there, and I don't know if we do a good enough job as a society signaling that and really encouraging more people to pursue this path.
it definitely has become a very political discussion around teachers and these negotiations, and you get a lot of rhetoric, kind of where I was going before about sort of the national coverage on these local issues. You get these high-level discussions that don't necessarily get the nuance of it all. So if you're interested, I'll share some of the articles out from the LA Times, from one of the Oakland newspapers, and one from Virginia, so you can get a better sense of what's happening on the ground there, and what really is at stake and what they're discussing. Brandon, any high-level discussion points here that we need to cover off on from your point of view about the state of teaching in 2019? We've talked about it a couple of times. We had one of our first episodes was about, teachers, we love teachers, and teachers are important. Any high-level thought processes here, whether from personal experience or from your professional experience, around where teaching is in 2019 and what might be next, as we discuss through strikes and quit rates and the like?
Yeah, I think I would just remind our listeners, I think teaching in 2019 is probably harder than it's ever been, right? In terms of technology enables teachers to do really cool things, but it's also technology in the classroom and like in the hands of smartphones and smartphones in the hands of kids introduces all sorts of class, discipline issues. There's cyberbullying stuff that you as a teacher get brought into. There's violence in schools that's maybe not the highest rate ever, but is too high, and dealing with things like school lockdowns or practice drills for school lockdowns, like that's a real issue. Teaching, it's not easy. It's maybe simple in a way, like what you have to do, but it's not easy. And so I guess I would just have some sympathy for those folks who find themselves really trying to do the really important work of educating our future leaders, the future generation of in our country, Americans or people around the world. That's hard work, and again, I think that the interests of any party in any of these negotiations is hard to understand from a distance, and it is, as you said, it becomes very politicized. Teacher unions are a very powerful force, and they're on one side of the aisle. And so I think when you're trying to have a clickbaity headline about any of this, it dehumanizes the humans on both sides of the negotiating table. And so I guess I would just say, remember how hard it is. And if you care to have an opinion, take a little bit of time to get under the hood and understand what the drivers are in that particular negotiation. You may learn some interesting things.
Absolutely. And we've talked at times on this podcast about the whole child, teaching the whole child. It's been obviously something that's grown over the past few years, going to grow more. Brandon pointed out cyberbullying, just all the things that go into what teachers do each and every day for our children has been something I've learned, and something I'm glad that I've been able to have an open mind to as my daughters go into public school each and every day. And we talked a bit with Brewer, Mike, about the whole teacher, educating the whole teacher, the professional development of it all. And so there are ways for people, companies like a CZI and the Neuro Teach to help this process as well, right? There's ways for other things to feed into teachers being taken care of, self-care, SEL, all those things. But there are ways that's happening outside of teacher negotiations.
Yeah, I think so. I think it comes down to empathy and just letting people know that they're valued and supported. In particular, and I've said this multiple times, like understanding how isolating it can be to be a teacher, right? Even though they're connecting to their students. Like part of why I think people are drawn to that is like, it's my classroom, I'm in charge, which is great. But then lots of times you're just left to your own devices, and you have competing demands coming at you from all different directions. I just think trying to spend a little bit of time thinking about what it must be like to be a teacher today, without being overly melodramatic about it. Like I think they can still bring joy, humor. They love what they're doing. They get fulfillment out of it. So it's not the salt mines, but I think frequently it is hard. And I think just knowing that people who are not in your field understand, or at least have some sense of the challenges that you're facing, I think can go a long way. It can even help with negotiations, frankly. Frequently, you just have to find some kind of common ground, some kind of common understanding, which comes from listening and coming from a place of empathy and kindness. So yeah, hopefully we'll continue to show that we value teachers on this show. We understand some of their needs, and we'd love to hear more from them. And obviously, this is a story we're going to continue to track because this is about as important a job as there is, and it's obviously presented with some challenges these days.
One to track indeed, one we'll come back to later on this year. We will have our predictions episode coming up soon for 2019. May hear a little bit about teachers in that episode. Plenty to cover on this topic, and we'll be sure to stay as close to it as we can here on Trending in Education. As always, you can find us on Twitter at Trending in Ed. Same on Facebook. You can find us at trendingineducation.com. As we asked at the end of 2018, if there are topics you want us to cover, feel free to reach out and let us know. With that said, thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with a brand new Trending in Education.